Mount Lyell, at 13,000 feet, is the highest peak in Yosemite National Park. Some years ago, 3 friends climbed to the top peak. They were experienced mountain climbers. 2 were experienced mountain climbers. Ben was not. Their base camp was 2,000 feet from the peak, but the climb to the top and back would take most of the day due to a glacier near the top of the peak. On the morning of the climb, they started out laughing and telling jokes. As the hours passed, the gap between Ben and his companions grew wider. Being competitive by nature, Ben looked for shortcuts so that he could catch up to them. There was an outcropping of rock ahead. The fact that the other 2 didn't choose this path didn't occur to him. He started climbing across. 30 minutes later, he was trapped in a cul-de-sac of rock, looking down several hundred feet of sheer ice pitched at about a 45-degree angle. He was only about 10 feet from safety, but one little slip and he wouldn't stop until he got to the valley floor. It was nearly noon, and the glacier glistened in the sun, making it hard to see. Ben was stuck and scared. It took an hour for his friends to find him. Standing on the rock he wanted to reach, one of them leaned out and used an ice axe to chip 2 footprints in the glacier. Then he gave him the following instructions. Ben, you must step out and put your foot where the first foothold is. When your foot touches it, without a moment's hesitation, swing your other foot up and land on the other footstep. From that point, I can reach down and pull you up. Sounded real good to Ben. But then his friend continued, as you step across, lean out from the glacier a bit, otherwise your feet may fly out from under you, and you'll start sliding down. Ben's instincts on the edge of a cliff were to lie down and hug the mountain, not to lean away from it. Ben looked at his good friend, hoping he was kidding, but he had no reason or logic not to trust the expert. So, based solely on trust in his friend, Ben stifled his impulse to cling, leaned out, and stepped up the icy stairway to safety. It took less than 2 seconds to find out if his faith in his friend was well-founded. It was. The top of the mountain for Moses and Elijah and Peter, James, and John were not fraught with the same kind of physical danger, but there was certainly room for trust. They had no idea what God was up to. God told Moses to come up the mountain and wait for tablets of stone with laws for his people. Moses had to sit halfway up for 40 days and 40 nights until God called him further up the mountain. Looking at God's back, Moses reached out and took the tablets of stone to carry down to the people. I wonder if that encounter was frightening. I think it would be to me. Then there's Elijah's story. He had just demonstrated that God was more powerful than Baal, and Ahab and Jezebel were out to get him. They were hunting him down to kill him. Eli fled to the wilderness and hid in a cave. God said, "What are you doing here, Elijah? Go to Mount Horeb and I'll meet you there." Elijah went to the mountain. There was a great wind so strong that it split the mountain and broke the rock in pieces. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind came an earthquake, but God was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, there came a fire, but God was not in the fire. And then came the sound of sheer silence. Elijah could feel the presence of God, and his fear was calmed and he received strength for his next assignment from God. As is often the case in the gospel stories, Jesus needed to get away to the mountains to pray. This time he took Peter, James, and John along with him. While he was praying, Jesus' face suddenly started radiating with light, and his clothes became brilliant white. Moses and Elijah suddenly appeared with Jesus. The disciples were awestruck at the sight of Moses and Elijah, and Peter offered to build dwellings for each of the guests. But a voice came out of the clouds. "This is my son, my beloved. Listen to him." The disciples were terrified and fell to the ground, but Jesus said, "Get up and don't be afraid." And when they stood up, Moses and Elijah were gone. Jesus was there alone. Jesus instructed them sternly, "Don't breathe a word of this to anyone." In all three cases, the characters were invited by God to the mountain. They were awestruck in the presence of God. Their eyes were open to the glory of God, and the experience was life-changing. Each of them was instructed to go down the mountain, and each was given a specific assignment to do. I think these are fascinating stories. Going and coming from the mountain took a lot of trust in divine direction. Frederick Buechner tells the story of his daughter's struggle with anorexia, the secret that the whole family was trying to keep. Then came one day when Buechner himself was in the pits of despair, worried that his daughter would never get well again. And then in the dark night came a message from an unusual quarter. Buechner writes, "I remember sitting parked by the roadside once, depressed and afraid about my daughter's illness and what was going on in my family, when out of nowhere, a car came along down the highway with a license plate that bore on it the one word of all the words in the dictionary that I needed most. The word was trust." What do you call a moment like that? Something to laugh off or a word from God? I believe that it was some of both, he says, but for me, it was an epiphany. The owner of the car turned out to be, as I suspected, a trust officer at the bank. Not long ago, he read an account of my story, found out where I lived, and one afternoon showed up with the license plate itself. It sits propped up on a bookshelf in my house to this day. It's a little rusty around the edges and a little battered, but it is also as holy a relic as I have ever seen. When have you come to an unmistakable understanding of God's glory? What symbols or signs do you hold precious because they remind you of a time of God's presence with you? Before I left for Holland, my pastor gave me a small stylized statuette figurine of Christ with his arms raised to heaven. I often admired that figurine in his office. Little did I know how significant that figurine would become to me in the days ahead. 3 months after coming to Holland, my father died. And without family to share the grief with, that figurine became the comforting word from God that said, "Lo, I am with you always." I put the figurine on my window ledge where I could see the church across the street as the backdrop. I wish I could show you that figurine, but I lost it, and I haven't found any like it on the internet. So I'm curious if you do have personal stories of a time you met God in a significant way. Is there a symbol or situation or place that you remember that was like the figurine for me or the license plate for Buechner. And I'd invite you just to name that symbol or place out loud. Anybody game? A shawl, okay. A shell. Okay. I thought surely somebody was going to say Camp Mac, because I've heard a lot of stories about that. Sometimes we'd like to hurry our transfiguration or our transformation along. Maybe we think that because we sit in church every Sunday morning, we should know all there is to know about God. But the epiphanies of discovery come one experience at a time. One understanding of God builds on another. Revelation that comes slowly builds a strong faith. There's a story about an amateur naturalist who saw a butterfly struggling to get out of its cocoon. The chrysalis had almost completed its transformation from caterpillar to butterfly and was just about ready to break out of that cocoon. The amateur watched closely. He was so amazed at the miracle. And then he did a very unwise thing. He took out his pocket knife and cut through the fibrous covering so the butterfly could get out. The butterfly emerged without a struggle and flew around, but it was very weak. What the amateur didn't know was that the very struggle to leave the cocoon was an important part of the butterfly's developing strength. Jesus had reason for taking Peter, James, and John along on the mountain. Jesus had just asked his disciples, "Who do you say I am?" And then he had told them that he would soon die. The disciples were stunned. It was inconceivable that this messenger from God, this Messiah, should be killed. But just as Elijah's and Moses' experiences bolstered their trust in God, so the disciples' faith was strengthened. It prepared them for times ahead when they would provide leadership in the early church. Against the pushback of the Romans, they knew whose they were and who they followed. John wrote about the transfiguration experience in his gospel. "We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only." And Peter wrote, "We did not follow cleverly invented stories when we told you about the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were witnesses to his majesty, for he received honor and glory from God the Father when the voice came to him from the majestic glory, saying, 'This is my Son whom I love. With him I am well pleased.' We ourselves heard this voice that came down from heaven when we were with him on the sacred mountain." It's from 2 Peter 1. Now that the transfiguration of Jesus took place during prayer, not during Jesus' public miracles or a teaching session, the time and place were right for this revelation of Jesus as God's Son. It wasn't a cognitive head recognition, rather an experiential heart recognition. It was life-changing and faith-strengthening. So, be brave. Trust the steps God carved for you. Lean back in faith. Grab hold and let God pull you up the mountain.